displays live marine animals as well as life-size models of dolphins and gray whales. The Sea Center's main attraction is a touch tank presenting the diversities of marine life. The tank features this adult swell shark, so come on down to the Sea Center and discover the wonders of the Santa Barbara Channel.
Good evening. Welcome to another edition of Third World News Review. My name is Cedric Robinson. I won't have to say much tonight at all because with me tonight are Helen Kwan, HQ, who will be commenting on some recent developments in the Philippines. We have a guest tonight, Mary Powers, and I'll be introducing her in just a second. And our third spokesperson tonight is Elizabeth Robinson, who may or may not have a chance to talk about
Libya.
And tonight we want to begin with our guest, Mary Powers. Mary has lived in Santa Barbara on 4 different occasions and has been a rather influential figure here, being very active at certain times with the Gray Panthers. And has an interesting background before the Gray Panthers. Mary was one of the people organizing delegates at the first United Nations Conference in San Francisco in 1945. And she went on to acquire a master's degree in international education here at UCSB later on. And taking that master's degree, went to Honduras, wasn't it?
Right,
As a member of the Peace Corps, spent 2 years there, working initially on the literacy project and then working with young women who were abandoned
by families.
And then more recently, in fact, this year, was it not? You went to Cuba.
Yes, I went in April with Global Exchange, which is based in San Francisco.
Tell us a little bit about Global Exchange.
Global Exchange is a remarkable organization that sends people in these, what they call reality tours. They're tours reasonably priced to third world countries, but also to all the continents. And this particular group was that I went on was on traditional and alternative medicine, although they do have tours 16 a year on many other subjects, film and so on. It was quite a fascinating 8 days, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone who wants to see, particularly with a theme. It's interesting that I was able to see a sampling of the best medical care of all kinds in the country in such a concentrated way that even though I was only there 8 days, it felt like 8 years.
Okay. Let me make certain that our viewers know that the country was Cuba.
Yes.
And it was traditional alternative medicine in Cuba.
That's correct.
And your group was, there were some very qualified people in your group.
Yes, it was an interesting mix of people. They were from all over the United States. There were 2 doctors. One was my roommate. She had just graduated in internal medicine in California, and then we had a cardiologist from Long Beach. We had a retired writer, and also 2 acupuncturists who have their own clinics. We had a therapeutic touch specialist. We were never quite sure exactly what that was, but it had something to do with working with the body. And it was a great group of people.
All right. So you went to Cuba, and in Havana, I think one of the places that you visited was what is called Chinatown in Havana?
Yes, that was a fascinating day, and it was so totally out of anything we had expected. We had gone there. Of course, our focus was medical clinics, any place that herbs were grown or people were being treated for any kind of medical problem, we would go to. And in at the Chinese Cultural Center, which was recently resurrected, since the climate's a little more open to people having their own cultures expressed, they have a large clinic, and they have both traditional and alternative. A lot of alternative medicine is done there. Of course, a lot of acupuncture and homeopathic, and they're even starting their own vegetable stands, and want to have a vegetable restaurant in the future.
So these are Chinese Cubans.
These are Chinese Cubans
who are now being encouraged through the official policy of the country,
right,
to explore their own heritage,
exactly,
and develop from that heritage new kinds of treatment and other sorts of aspects.
It was very interesting that there was such a mix of languages. The Chinese doctors on the staff spoke Spanish. The Spanish-speaking doctors also spoke Chinese. Nobody spoke English. We did have a guide who was with us constantly. But it was very interesting to hear about green medicine and the use of herbs and acupuncture, traditional in China, now being used in a great way in that clinic.
Excellent, excellent.
Can you tell us a little bit, how old is the Chinese community there? Did you have a sense of that?
It has been isolated. The Chinese people first came to Cuba in 1847, 200 of them, to replace the blacks in the sugarcane fields, and but they've been living in the last 30 years very isolated, and just recently, when things became more open, they began to organize this center. So it's, I would say, probably in the last 5 years, it's become pretty active. They raise all their own money.
Could you probably tell us a little bit why, for example, non-Western medicine is being, I mean, I think that Cuba is not the only country that's herbal and particularly non-Western medicine. It's popular, particularly in Cuba. I know that some of my friends went, and that struck them as well, and I was wondering how much of that has to do with the embargo against.
Well, of course, the embargo has created a tremendous need to replace the lack of medicine, and not just medicine, but supplies for surgeries and so forth. But they're able to substitute and to use things like homeopathy, and the Cuban doctors work as a team. They're very seldom alone. They have physiotherapists, and they use acupuncturists. They use even things like flower aromatherapy, and all these substitute remedies, because they don't have, for instance, the oxygen tents that we were talking about. That in one very large hospital, they only had 2. And because of the embargo, which had impacted that particular hospital greatly, they had 20 patients that needed to be in oxygen tents, which showed to me the direct effect that the embargo had on that particular institution.
Mary, can you? One of the things that we always hear about has been strongest about Cuba since the revolution has been the healthcare system and the degree to which it meets, well, relative to our own, it provides care to a broad spectrum of people.
Yes.
Is that still the sense? And I mean, what do you do in a situation where you need 20 oxygen tents and you've got 2? What kinds of what's happening to the healthcare system itself?
Well, in the case of the oxygen tents, they did the only thing that common sense, I guess, would dictate, which is that they alternated. They took the ones that patients that were the most in need for the longest time, but then they would alternate. Some of the people were older, and if they had a severe lung problem, then they were on it perhaps a little longer. But they've improvised, and they've also had a lot of help from other countries. Not enough, of course, to cover what the embargo prevents them from having, but they are getting daily supplies from many other countries.
One of the things that the American press has been encouraged to publicize is the number of children from Russia who were in the Ukraine, the Chernobyl victims, who have been brought to the United States for treatment. But you ran across some Chernobyl patients in Cuba.
Yes, that was one of the most exciting and in a way sad, but also very impressive visits that we made to their treatment center at a place called Tamara, which is way out and near the ocean. The air is drier there, and it helps to heal some of the burns. There's pictures of the kids that we met. You notice the white patches on the skin. Those are from, of course, the burns suffered in the explosion. These kids were probably among the healthiest that we saw, and they had been there a year. We didn't know what was going on inside of their bodies, but we were told that some huge percent, like 80% of the children, would be there for very long periods of time.
This is the older group, and there was a younger group as well.
Yes, and they put on a show that was just incredible. After we made our visit to the cottage where these kids you just saw were living, they put on an outdoor show with a platform and all the people, you know, guests and all of us watching. The Ukrainian kids had learned something in Spanish. It's only Spanish they spoke, and so that was kind of fun. But one of the nice things is that some of these, I'm not sure which, of course, were sisters and brothers that had come along to keep the one who's a patient company. And it was interesting that in all the facilities where one stayed overnight, you know, in a medical facility, there was always an extra bed because Cubans feel basically their health care system says that care and concern for the patient is more important than anything else they can do. That's a priority. So some of those kids were probably younger brothers and sisters that had come from the Ukraine.
You had mentioned earlier that there are indeed some foreign donors to Cuba, and one of those is Japan.
Yes, we had a wonderful visit to a place called the Botanical Gardens, which is on a huge, it's actually called Lennon Park. It's about 200 acres of, including amusement park and rodeo grounds and all that. But this is a picture of one of the very modern, I think there were 4 enormous greenhouses where they grow every conceivable kind of plant. Many of them are gifts from, in fact, they're grouped according to either country or continent. And they grow something like 60 plants that can be used for medicinal purposes. And then in connection with that is is what they call the Echo Restaurant, which is a vegetarian restaurant. It's just really a innovative thing for the country because they're great meat eaters, kind of like we are. But they're introducing this as again, a necessity because of the food shortage due to the embargo, but also because it's healthier. And they're working at it slowly but surely. I think they're selling the idea pretty well.
The continuity is really very interesting. I was there 11 years ago, and at the time, with respect to the Chernobyl children that you met, I went to the island of youth, Isla de Juventud.
Oh, you did.
And there, of course, were these children who had been orphaned from the war in Namibia and in Angola, and they were being cared for by the Cuban government, educated, etc. There's also the continuity in terms of particularly the health program. When I was there in '85, Cuba had graduated the first class of Cuban doctors trained in Cuba since the revolution.
Is that so?
So they had lost many of their doctors from immigration after the Cuban Revolution, and the interim generations had been trained in Soviet Union and elsewhere. So the first group to be trained in Havana graduated in 1985, and I got a chance to talk to
From the University of Havana, no?
Yes. And it was also the period in which, in terms of this third point, that you were introducing alternative medicine and essentially a kind of community or national health program. Cubans were then beginning their anti-smoking campaign. And Fidel Castro, who you know was a great cigar smoker, was taking to chewing his cigars, but not lighting them.
Awful. Sounds dreadful.
So there's a...
He's given them up, I understand.
Yes, yes. Well,
for health reasons.
Inevitably it comes to most of us. I'm still a smoker, unfortunately. So in any case, those 3 points I wanted to suggest are continuity.
Yes.
The caring of children from other countries, that children who had been orphaned or damaged in wars, the continued development of Cuban public health, and third, this interest in pushing a different kind of behavior onto the Cuban people to extend their lives.
Very true. In one clinic that we went to, they hold AA meetings there, and they talked about alcoholism as not being a major problem, but still it is a problem. And their basic philosophy was we need to change people's habits, and they were doing that. There was one man who was coming into his doctor, who also serves, as you know, as a sort of counselor. He's not just a doctor, he's kind of a friend and counselor to the community. And this man had come in, and he had been giving blood a great deal, and he wasn't doing too well. And so the doctor said, well, you know, he said, this is causing all kinds of health problems for you, and lowering your immunity. You need to change that. And there was another story like that. So that's another way of coming at the problems. The other thing that you mentioned about doctors newly coming into the country when you were there, they are just graduating. I don't know how many, thousands and thousands, and 50% of them are women. It was actually larger in medical school, but the standards are higher. I think you have to maintain a 96-point average if you're a woman, and not quite so much if you're a man.
No, you're just exaggerating again.
Doesn't seem quite fair to me. But 50% is not bad, you know. And the dentists are huge. I think it's 70% of the dentists are women. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Well, head of the program that I met, they were doing some experimental community health in an area of Havana called Lawton. And they were assigning doctors to neighborhoods where they would live and have no more than 200 patients on their list. But she was a Cuban, she was a woman as well, and had a great deal of influence on all of the doctors. She was supervising something like 15 to 20 doctors, and they were all very, very powerfully committed to her. While you were in Cuba, and let's mention the dates.
Yes, I was. We left Los Angeles on March 31st and returned on April 9th. So it was just a long week, really.
Yeah.
That was this year, of course.
And while you were there was an international incident involving the United States and Cuba.
Yes, actually, well, just 2 weeks after the planes were shot down, which everybody knows about, we went ahead with our trip. Of course, we're concerned that maybe they would call it off, but no, it went forward. And we never heard, it was never mentioned. We never heard, as a matter of fact, anything political, of course, partly because our focus was strictly and narrowly the medical aspect of things, but we never discussed it, although one doctor did say to us, and we saw him 2 or 3 times, a very distinguished gentleman, that how much they appreciated our coming at that time and our support of during this what they call the special period, which is their name for the embargo. And I remember saying, gee, I wish there was something we could do to really help you with all of your needs, you know. And the doctor said, well, in Spanish, he said, well, what you're doing is something, which was encouraging.
This special period is, how long now, Elizabeth? It was imposed by the Kennedy administration or by the Eisenhower administration? I can't remember which.
Kennedy.
By the Kennedy administration?
Yeah. And this most recent special period has been intensified in just this last year.
Yeah. So the embargo, which I don't think we have to remind our viewers, but it may be noteworthy. The embargo has been declared by international forums as illegal. All right, it's an embargo by the United States on Cuba. And now, as Mary was saying before the program, and as you just indicated, the Cuban Democracy Act, which was passed, I guess, in '94, imposed some special restrictions, some additional restrictions, one of which is to penalize foreign governments, you know, and their citizens from trading with Cuba. And we know that there are a number of countries, France, Canada, are 2. Belgium, which intend indeed to challenge, Italy and Spain, which intend to challenge.
Member of the Euro Union.
Yeah. So Canada and members of the European Union have all declared their hostility and resistance to this new legislation. It will come into effect next month, August. And I suspect the World Court at The Hague will be a recipient of a number of formal complaints from foreign governments.
It's kind of ironic, I think, on sort of 2 counts, because part of the reason why this amendment or this bill was debated in the first place was really the U.S. attempt, because it was getting kind of desperate, because it was almost embarrassing in the international community, because not just the European country, but the South American countries were trading with Cuba, and they were, quite frankly, were frustrated with the U.S. embargo. And so the U.S. response, instead of liberalizing it, sort of tightened the embargo. And it's, of course, it's ironic because for the last so many years, the U.S. has been jumping around the world talking about free trade. And so now the European powers are threatening to also take the U.S. to the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, for basically illegal restricting trade. So it's very, very ironic.
There was also a congressional election at issue. So it was mean-spirited, parochial, and small-minded, and special interest. And the planes that were shot down that Mary referred to earlier was, of course, the Cuban Air Force had shot down a plane or two planes that were being operated by a Cuban exile group for their own purposes. And the United States Clinton administration made the claim, which has now been verified apparently by the United Nations, that the planes, when shot down, were in international airspace, but did not indeed, the report by the United Nations did not indeed refute the Cubans' claim that they had violated Cuban airspace. So they were there and coming out when they were shot down.
I found that one thing very, very interesting, and I'm sure that you would have if you'd been there now instead of in '85, and that is that apparently there was no bitterness or any lack of graciousness or friendliness to us, and here we are representing the country that's causing problems in such gigantic proportions, you know, limiting food, the poor people. I mean, we ate well, but we're tourists, and you know, the poor people either have to grow something, or they have to go to the black market, or you know, in order to get enough to eat. And even the doctors, they said, to feed their families, you know, had to go to the black market. But there was no reaction like, you know, rudeness or anything like that. And I kept thinking, I wonder how it would be if the situation were reversed, if we'd be as polite to
as cordial,
as cordial to our. I hope so.
I tend to doubt it.
Yeah.
The demonization of Cuba is a fairly long-term phenomena here.
They just won't buckle under, it seems.
No,
you know?
no, they won't behave.
They won't behave.
Are there any other questions you want to?
No, I just, one last thing, perhaps. You mentioned something about pharmacies and seeing pharmacies there, and I think one of the things, I mean, it's hard to understand how the embargo is having an impact if other countries are ignoring it, but it is indeed having a pretty tremendous one. What were you saying about earlier about the pharmacies?
Yes, I thought sort of symbolic of the senselessness of restricting medicines and anything for medical care was what was symbolic was seeing pharmacies in little towns or almost anywhere, and usually the door is open because it's warm, and you peer in the window and there are 3 bottles of medicine on the shelves, and it's very sad, but that was it, and you know, it just seems so totally cruel to me, and I'm sure most of us agree. I believe I read that something like 80-some% of the United States is against the embargo, and even the Cubans who are in the United States, not the ones in Miami necessarily, but many other Cubans are also a huge percentage against it. So you wonder who's really for it.
Well, a substantial number of Cubans go back to Cuba regularly. There used to be, when I went to Cuba, I flew from Miami to Havana on a private airline called Mar Azul, and the plane was packed with Cubans who would go down on a weekly basis and take to their families various things. So the embargo is being broken, violated all the time by Cubans in residence in America, United States. Elizabeth, you had something else?
No, that's fine.
Would it be all right if you have a moment, I could tell people who don't know, because most of us I'm sure none in our group knew exactly what the restrictions were about going to the country. And I'll just read you this paragraph. Although the United States government maintains strict restrictions on travel to Cuba, there are provisions in the law that allow U.S. citizens to travel in Cuba. And the way that is done is that you go through a third country. The United States approves of that. If you're going on a mission, you're going to in a study group. If you have credentials and you're hired, you have an assignment, you're doing research, then you can be licensed by the Treasury Department. If you went, as I did, I didn't have meet any of those requirements. I went as what they call fully escorted, which I thought was an intriguing term. So that while I guess by the letter of the law it's illegal, out of one side of the mouth, out of the other side, they tell you how to do it. So people that want to take this kind of a trip should be aware that, you know, nobody's been prosecuted, and they're very much welcomed.
Yeah. The Pediatricians for Peace, whom we've
Parents
had.
parents and pediatricians, yeah.
Parents and Pediatricians for Peace. We've had a representative who is a pediatrician on our program, an Egyptian-born American who has on 3, I think, occasions gone to and taken medical supplies for children's hospitals and children's care through
Specifically,
Mexico.
Yes.
Through
insulin.
Mexico. Insulin.
It's
Oh,
been,
that's wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think the last time they took a bus, which was a very difficult trip for them because it was in the summer, and they were stopped at the U.S.-Mexican border, and the Immigration Naturalization Service people refused to allow them across the Mexican border. So they went on a hunger strike and sat in the bus. And
Very similar to the Pastors for Peace and the computers.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had a hunger strike that went for weeks
Weeks and weeks.
until the computers were finally allowed to go across.
But in both instances, the American government relented after these people had shown their resolve, and
That's right.
they were able to take their supplies to Cuba. It is a kind of measure of this extraordinary will among the American people, and at the same time an indication of the extraordinary stupidity of the American government, but that's the way it is. Thank you very much, Mary, for being
My pleasure.
a guest on our
Enjoyed
program.
being here.
And in your other sojourns, if you have a chance, come back and talk to us
Thank
again.
you. Thank you. I have to save up some more money before I can come back.
No, we don't charge. I understand what you mean. I understand what you mean. Thank you very much.
Sure.
We want to move to Asia in a story that Helen Kwan HQ has been preparing, having to do with the Philippines.
Yeah. Last Monday, I guess if I wasn't sick, I would have reported it would be more current, but still I think it's, in fact, because 1 week has lapsed, there's more information